What's up, everyone? Today we're going to continue talking about Azure Function apps and developing them in PowerShell with a demo of how you can use Visual Studio Code to develop them locally and test them before deploying them out into your Function app in production or anything like that. This is a continuing video in a series I'm doing talking about Azure Function apps. You can find a link to the playlist down below. My name is Jeff. This is Jeff Brown Tech. Let's go ahead and get started. First thing you'll need is Visual Studio Code. If you don't have that installed, you'll need to go and download and install it. It's available across Windows, Mac, and I believe and even Linux. And the first thing we're going to take a look at is you'll want to go into the extension tab here, and you'll want to do a search. I've already got it installed here, but you'll look for Azure Functions. It is written and deployed by Microsoft. What this will do is enable the ability for you to create and manage functions locally and then also deploy them out into your Azure tenant. One thing I'm going to also point out is, let me scroll down here and point out this one here about running the service app locally. You'll also need to download and install the Azure Function Core tools. That's a link right here to be able to do that. And when you go to debug it later, I think it will prompt you if you don't have them installed. But anyway, you can just avoid that by just going down in here or searching for that and getting that downloaded also. Another extension I would recommend, I don't believe you need it though in order to do the things we'll need to do, but there is also Azure Resources from Microsoft. This just gives you a handy way to log in and view all the resources that you have deployed out in your Azure tenant. Again, I don't think this one is necessary, but it's a nice thing to have as well. Now, before we get started, let's switch back out to the Azure portal. And I have a new function app here. I know we've been working with that other one, but I wanted to deploy a new one here. It's JBT VS Code Demo Func app. And right now I just wanted to point out that this one is blank. We do not have any functions out here currently because we're going to be deploying them from Visual Studio Code. And I believe when you do that, it will overwrite anything that we have out here. So I just want to start with a blank function app, but just pointing out that right now we don't have any functions in our new function app here. Back here in Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and close this out. Let's go over to our Explorer, and I have a folder open on my local system called VS Code Demo. That's where we'll be working with our function apps. To get started working with our Azure Function extension, if you just press F1, it's going to bring up our command bar here. And if you start typing Azure Functions and a colon, it's going to bring up all the commands that you can use to interact or work with Azure Functions and your function apps. What I am focused on here is I want to create a function. When we select that, it's going to ask you to select the folder that contains your function project. Since I already have this one open, it's defaulted to that, so we'll go ahead and select it. You'll need to select a language. This needs to match the language of the function app out in the portal that we're going to be working with, which is PowerShell. So I'm going to select it. And then we need to select a template. This is just like we've seen in previous videos. When you go to create a function out in the portal, you need to select which one you want to be working with or a template. You can do a blank one if you want, but let's start with our handy dandy HTTP trigger. I'm going to leave it just at the default name here because I'm not so much worried about naming or anything like that. I'm just showing the tool of how Visual Studio Code works with Azure Function apps. So we'll leave that at its default right now. And then I'm also selecting just anonymous. I don't want to have to worry about any authorization keys or anything while I'm working with this. All right, so that went through and created a whole bunch of files for us. Let's go through and take a look at what each one is doing for us. Again, we have our standard HTTP trigger template here. We've seen this before in other videos. And this is living underneath a folder called HTTP trigger 1. That's the name of our function when we went through and created it. We have our run PS1. Then we also have our function.json. This contains our input and output bindings. Our standard ones that we have for this template is our HTTP trigger in, so we can send in information, or that's how we trigger it. And then we're going to get an HTTP response back. And this is where we would also define other things if we're working with queue services, blobs, tables, all the other services that we have access to. We've seen that in other videos. Some of the other things I want to point out, let me collapse this folder here. And at the root of our project here, our VS Code demo, we have a couple of other files we want to take a look at. We have a func_ignore. This is just files we're not going to upload when we publish this out to our function app. This is a file that defines other files and folders that we don't want to upload. We also have a git ignore file here. It does automatically turn this folder into a Git repository. So if you're going to upload it to something like GitLab, GitHub, or Azure DevOps, it's not going to include these files and folders in it. We have our standard host.json with our other settings here for managed dependencies and our extension bundles and everything. I'm going to skip this next file for just a second. We also have our profile. We've seen this before. You can put things in here. So when the function app starts up, if you want to set anything that way, and we saw this example here, if we had a managed identity assigned to this, it's going to automatically connect out to our Azure tenant. Then we have our requirements PSD1 file. If we want to include any modules that are out in the PowerShell gallery, we can include that here with our function app. Now, the file I skipped here is a local settings JSON file. This is where you can set key value pairs or environment variables to use inside of your functions. We've seen this before out in the portal where we were setting connection strings and everything to work with our different services. This allows you to put it locally, and it's in both of our ignore files, so it's not included if we upload this or anything. It's strictly for working locally with services here. That's all of our files and everything that I want to point out. Let's go back into our run PS1 file. Again, our standard code here. I'm not going to make a lot of changes to this. What I'm primarily interested in is testing this function locally before I deploy it out into my function app in the Azure portal. That way I can test my code changes or make sure everything works as expected before deploying it out there. And because in previous videos, I was just doing all my editing and everything out in the portal. But in real life, you probably want to do development locally, make sure everything works, and then deploy it out there. In order to test our functions locally, let's go over to the Run and Debug tab here. And I'm going to increase the size of my terminal here a little bit. And let's go ahead and select our play button here. And we can see some output happening here inside of our terminal window. I'm going to give it just a second longer because it switches back to our primary one here. But what I want to point out is we have our primary terminal here that we've been working with, but then there should be a secondary one that pops up here. So let's go into it. And what you can see here is it's running a local web server, basically, where we can test our functions. And we have our HTTP trigger one. That's just our default one that we created earlier. And we get a URL that we can test against. Let me go ahead and copy this into my clipboard. And let's switch back over to our PowerShell window and test this out. Here I am out in just a PowerShell window that's separate from VS Code and everything. We'll go ahead and run our invoke REST method commandlet. We'll put in our method as post, and then our URI is going to be what we just copied there. We'll go ahead and invoke this, and then also pay attention right down here at the bottom of the screen. We'll start seeing some output as the function runs. It'll be very similar to what we've seen out in the Azure portal when we were testing our functions there. All right, go ahead and bring this up and press enter. And there we go. It came back and gave us our generic response. And then we can also see the output here. We see everything that we saw before. It's processing request, loading the function, everything like that. And just to do some more testing here, we can come in and pass in a parameter here within the URI itself. And then we get back the different response saying, hello, Jeff, this HTTP triggered function executed successfully. So this is awesome. We now have a way to test our functions locally and to make sure they're working as expected before we put it out into our function app out in our portal, which is actually the next step that we want to do. Back here inside of Visual Studio Code, if you want, you can stop and disconnect from that session there. So we'll go ahead and hit disconnect. And then we'll come down here inside of our terminal and just press any key to exit out of there. Now that we have our function here, let's go ahead and deploy it out into our function app inside our Azure tenant. Go ahead and hit F1 again. Let's go to Azure Functions, bring up all our commands for that. And we should have an option here for deploy to Azure. So we'll go ahead and select it. It's going to ask us what subscription we want to use. I'll use my demo subscription. and then select a function app that we want to deploy to. I believe the one we're doing here is GBT VS Code Demo Func App. I've got a couple of different ones here that I've been working with. And then it's going to come up and say, are you sure you want to deploy this? This is going to write any previous deployments and cannot be undone. Let's go ahead and deploy. And this is going to zip up all of our files here inside of a project folder and then send it out there. And then it also has to reload the function app since it just got new code there that it needs to do. So this can take a few seconds. We'll let this run here and come back to it when it's done. Okay, that took a minute or so. We can see that the deployment was successful. Let me close out of this. Let's switch back over to our Azure portal. Out here in the Azure portal, again, I just want to point out we don't have any functions right here. But if we go ahead and refresh, we can see we now have a couple here, and we see our one here of our HTTP trigger 1. So great. So we developed locally inside of our VS Code and then push those files and that function out here to our function app. What we demonstrated so far is a great way to work with HTTP, but what if you want to work with other services like we did in the other videos, like an Azure storage account with blobs, containers, and queues and files and everything like that? There's another great extension we can work with in Visual Studio Code to do that. So let's switch back over there and get started with it. Back here in Visual Studio Code, let me pull our terminal down here a little bit. Let's go back into extensions. And another extension you want to take a look at is called Azurite. This is also for Microsoft. But what it is an open source API compatible server where you can use it to simulate blob, queue, and tables working locally here on your system. So if you're writing code that works with those, especially inside these Azure functions, you can have a storage account basically on your system here to interact with those services. Another great resource that you'll want to download and install to work with this is also called the Azure Storage Explorer. I've already got that installed, so let's switch over to that application. Now you can use the Storage Explorer to log in and connect to storage accounts and other services that you have out in your Azure tenant. You can work with those locally instead of having to go to your portal, especially great if you want to download or upload a lot of files to it. But in our case, we're going to use it so we can see the files and everything and other services inside our simulated storage account. Once you have it open and installed, if you go under Emulator and Attached and expand out storage accounts and go under Attached Containers, or let's see here, Emulator, it's probably going to time out here in just a second because I actually don't have it running. So let's go back and close this. Back in Visual Studio Code, let's bring back up our command bar here. And if we type in Azurite and a colon, we have the option to start the local service. And you can see there's lots of other options here. We can just start a blob service or queue or table, just be very specific, but let's start it for everything. Okay, so that should be running now. And it is kind of hard to see, but it does show it's running on our local system 127.0.0.1. And our queue service is running on port 10,001. Let's go back over to Storage Explorer. We'll click on this and refresh it here. And now we can see we have our different services up and running. Let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit here to make that better. Perfect. Okay. So we have our blob containers. If we expand this out, we don't have anything underneath here right now. If I go back up to Emulator, we have our properties here. And we can see our different services are running. It does give a default name of dev store account 1. That's perfectly fine. I don't see any reason to change that. And then we have different services running based on their port. We have blob running on 10,000, queue 10,001, and table on 10,002. Unless you already have some other services running on those ports on your system, more than likely Azurite wouldn't start anyway, but I don't see any reason to change those either. And then we have some connection strings here if you need those also. Before we continue, I want to create a couple of things out here. Let's go under blob containers, and I'm going to create a container just called files. And then let's go under tables. And under tables, let's create a table called orders. This is very similar to what we saw before in other videos that we were working on in this series. Because now I want to go back to my function app inside of Visual Studio Code and create output bindings so we can work with these different services. Back in Visual Studio Code, let's close this out and we'll leave our run file up there because we'll make a couple of changes to it. The first thing I want to do is let's go into local settings JSON, and we have something here for Azure Web Job Storage. What we want to do is we can come in and paste in a value here called use development storage equal true. This is telling your Azure function app that there's local storage that you can use, and it's going to automatically connect out to that Azurite emulated storage and use it inside of our function app. That's the first thing we need to do. And again, this is just setting it locally here. This will not be uploaded into our storage or our function app in the portal later. The next thing we need to do is add some output bindings for our different services. Let's go into function.json here. And I have two services that I want to paste in here. So let's go ahead and do that. I need to add in my comma here. The first one is going to be named blob out. It's an output binding. We're going to be saving blobs out to our storage account. The path is going to be files, which is the container we just created, and then random GUID for the file name is just generate one automatically, and then ending in txt. And the important thing here is connection. We are going to set it to Azure Web Job Storage. That way it'll automatically connect out to our emulator storage and work with it there. Next, our table out. It's a table service. Our table name is orders, which we just created. And again, we need to set our Azure Web Job Storage value here. Again, that is going to match up with what we have inside of our local settings JSON file. Let me go back into function here. Let's save this. So our output names here are blob out and table out. Let's get back into our function here and let's just add a couple of things so we can work with this. Now I just need some content to add to our file and then also to put into our table storage. So again, we'll just do push output binding. The name of that output binding is going to be blob out. And then for the value of our file, we will just put in whatever we have inside of body, just this string here. Just make that nice and simple. And then for our table output, I'm going to paste in some other code here. I'm just going to generate a random row key value here between 1000 and 9999. We're going to set the partition key to the name that we pass in to lower, and then use our push output binding. It's table out and setting our partition key and our row key there. And I think one other thing I need to do is let's add this in here. If name has a value, we'll pass that in. Else we'll say name equals. We need to put in a default value here just so I have something inside of my partition key later. All right, so we will save that. I think we are good to go here. Again, just putting in some code to test and show you this functionality. Okay, let's expand back up our terminal here. Let's see if this works on the first try. It's been a little finicky when I've been trying to go through and look at this. So let's go ahead and start our emulator here. Yeah, exactly. So let me go back here. It does come back. I've had this happening. Same port 7071 isn't available, basically meaning our Func app, the local emulator is already running again. I'm not sure why that, while exiting out previously, hasn't been cleaning that up. Back here inside of PowerShell, let's do stop process and name is func. Okay, I believe that will clear up any services or anything that's running under that executable. And let's try this again. Okay, perfect. So that's running and it's going to switch back to our window here. Let me give it just a second. Let's go back over to this terminal window. Now it's running as expected. Let's go back out to PowerShell. We have our previous runs here. So I'll just go back up and run this one here. We'll invoke REST method. Okay, they look like that completed successfully. I don't see any errors or warnings in our output down below. So let's go through and run this a couple of other times. We'll do some other names here. We'll do a default one. Perfect. So that completed. We just did 3 tests. Looks like everything looks good. Let's go back out to Storage Explorer and see if we have our expected results. Back here in Storage Explorer, we have our orders table. Let's do a quick refresh. And we can see we now have 3 entries, 3 different partition keys here based on the names that we passed in: Alice, Azure, and Jeff. Actually, Azure was just the default one, and our randomly generated row key there. Let's go back under files, and we should also have 3 files here. Let's right click on it and do a refresh. Now we see we also have 3 files here, but don't know which one went to which. So let's just pick this top one. If I double click on it, it will download the file locally and we'll open it up here inside of Notepad. And if I bring this over, we can see this must have been the default one because that's the default text that we got out there. But perfect, we did have a file created here and everything is working as expected. Again, so using Azurite, we can simulate local storage accounts and be able to continue developing our Azure Function apps and work with those before we upload and push them out to our Function app out in our tenant. In fact, let's go ahead and do that and see our code be updated. Back here in the Function app out in our portal, let's go back into HTTP trigger 1. I always like to show the before and after so you can see it working as expected. If we minimize logs here, you can see we don't have any of our other changes. Right around here, we added some other code and some other push output bindings, but you can see they're not here right now. Let's actually go back to Visual Studio Code. Back in Visual Studio Code, let's bring up our command bar and let's go back to deploy to Azure. Again, it's going to ask us all the same things. What I want to point out is right now, this is what we're doing here is not necessarily connected out to what we're doing inside of the Function app in the tenant out in our portal. I could easily go and deploy this to another one. There's no direct connection. We're just selecting what we want to deploy here. And again, this is going to overwrite and take a second here. So let's make sure it gets started. Okay, yeah, and then we'll give it some time. I'm going to pause and let this finish up doing what it needs to do. Okay, with that completed, let's switch back out to the Azure portal. I've already got the code back up here, and if we just do a refresh, we see our changes here. Down here in the bottom part of it, we have our additional output bindings and setting up our random row keys and everything like that and defaulting our name. We were able to develop and test everything locally, and then once we verified it's working as expected, push the code back out to our Function app inside of our tenant. That does it for what I wanted to cover here. Just wanted to show you that you can use Visual Studio Code in order to develop all these things locally, test them out, make sure they work, and then deploy them out via Visual Studio Code out to Function apps inside of your tenant. This is going to work really great if you are working by yourself, but what's really nice is if you could put this in a repository, put it in something like GitHub, Azure DevOps, GitLab, any other thing like that, and then package it up and deploy it after a pull request or something like that. So I think that's what I'll do next is just show a CI/CD pipeline example of deploying your code out to Function apps using those types of mechanisms. That does it for this video. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.